May 15th, 1817. The Westbrook ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns in shades of ivory and rose, across jewels that caught the brilliance and threw it back in rainbow fragments. The orchestra played a lively country dance, and the floor swirled with motion, with youth, with laughter that rang bright as crystal against marble floors. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of it all, as she had stood for 11 seasons, her position as fixed and unremarkable as the potted palms that lined the perimeter. She wore a gown of blue silk that had been fashionable 3 years prior, altered twice to accommodate changing styles, the color still fine, but the cut betraying its age to any discerning eye. At 29, Eleanor had learned to make herself small, to occupy the spaces between notice, to expect nothing beyond the thin courtesy society afforded spinsters who had long since ceased to matter. Her face, though not unpleasant, bore the unmistakable mark of resignation, a certain stillness in her expression that came from years of being looked through rather than at. Her brown hair, dressed simply, framed features that might have been called handsome in a kinder world. But handsomeness was not what the marriage mart valued. Youth, vivacity, a certain decorative charm, these were the currencies that purchased regard, and Eleanor's purse had been empty for years. She watched her younger sister Margaret's friends whirl past in the arms of eligible gentlemen, girls who had been children when Eleanor first entered society, now wives themselves, some already mothers. The sight no longer pained her as it once had. She had made peace with invisibility, or so she told herself in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep refused to come. The sudden stir near the entrance drew every eye, and Eleanor felt the shift in the room's attention like a change in air pressure before a storm. The Duke of Pembroke had arrived. Eleanor had heard the whispers, as everyone had. He had inherited the title 6 months prior upon his elder brother's unexpected death, called back from diplomatic service abroad to assume responsibilities he had never expected to bear. He was 35, unwed, and possessed of a fortune that made even the wealthiest families recalculate their daughters' prospects. The crowd parted for him, as water parts for a ship's prow, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of dark hair, broad shoulders clothed in evening black of such perfect tailoring, it could only have come from Weston, a face that carried both weariness and something else, something watchful and measuring. His gaze swept the ballroom with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading rooms, to assessing what lay beneath surface pleasantries, and then, impossibly, his eyes found hers. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps less, but Eleanor felt it like a physical touch, a jolt of recognition that made no sense because they had never met, because men like him did not see women like her. Before she could make sense of it, he was surrounded by society matrons, presenting daughters like offerings at an altar, and the moment, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. Eleanor turned and slipped through the doorway that led to the library. Seeking refuge in the only place she had ever truly belonged, her heart beating with a confusion she could not name and dared not examine. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The library smelled of leather and beeswax, of aging paper and the faint ghost of pipe smoke from some previous occupant. And Eleanor breathed it in like medicine, letting the familiar comfort settle her rattled nerves. The sounds of the ball reached her only faintly here, muffled by thick walls and heavy doors, the music reduced to a ghostly pulse that seemed to come from another world entirely. She ran her fingers along the spines of books she had examined at a dozen such gatherings, seeking refuge in the same rooms because the library was always safe, always empty, always willing to shelter those who did not belong among the glittering crowd. She pulled a volume from the shelf without looking at the title, needing only the weight of it in her hands, the solid reality of something that would not judge or dismiss her. And when she finally focused on the cover, she felt a small shock of recognition. Italian architecture of the Renaissance, the gilt letters proclaimed, and she opened it to find detailed engravings of buildings she had only dreamed of seeing, structures of such perfect proportion and beauty that her throat tightened with longing for a life that extended beyond London ballrooms and pitying glances. She was so absorbed in a drawing of a Florentine palazzo that she did not hear the door open, did not sense another presence until a voice spoke from behind her, low and measured and unmistakably masculine. "I wondered where you had gone," the voice said, and Eleanor turned so quickly she nearly dropped the book, her heart leaping into her throat as she found herself facing the Duke of Pembroke alone, in a room where no chaperone would think to follow, because no one imagined a duke would pursue a spinster into the shadows. "Your Grace," she managed, executing a curtsy that felt clumsy under his steady gaze. "I apologize. I did not mean to intrude. I shall return to the ballroom." He raised one hand in a gesture that was both graceful and commanding. "Please do not," he said, his eyes moving to the book she clutched like a shield. "I came seeking escape from the chaos as well, though I confess I also came seeking you. We were not properly introduced, and I find myself curious about the one woman in that ballroom who looked as though she wished to be anywhere else." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain whether his words were kindness or subtle mockery. "I am Miss Eleanor Ashworth, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice level through years of practice at maintaining dignity in uncomfortable moments. "Forgive me, I did not realize my feelings were so transparent." He moved closer, close enough that she could see his eyes were not merely dark, but a deep grey, like winter skies before snow. "Alexander Pembroke," he said, as though his title were an afterthought. "And transparency is not a fault, Miss Ashworth. It is a rarity. Most faces in that ballroom are masks worn so long their owners have forgotten what lies beneath. Tell me, what draws you to Italian architecture?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely interested in its delivery, that Eleanor found herself answering honestly instead of deflecting with the self-deprecating humor she had learned to employ. "The harmony of it," she said quietly, "the way proportion and beauty serve purpose rather than vanity, the sense that something can be both functional and transcendent. I have studied it for years through books, though I do not suppose I shall ever see the buildings themselves." "Why not?" he asked, and the question hung between them like a challenge until the door burst open and Lady Catherine Rushworth swept in, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with predatory interest. "Your Grace, there you are," she declared, her voice bright with false warmth. "We have all been searching for you. And here you are, tucked away with dear Eleanor. How amusing." Eleanor felt the moment shatter like dropped crystal, felt herself become invisible again as Lady Catherine positioned herself between them, chattering about the dancing and the supper and all the young ladies waiting hopefully for the Duke's attention, and when Eleanor slipped from the room, neither of them seemed to notice her departure, though she could have sworn she felt his eyes follow her into the corridor beyond. May 16th, 1817. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Ashworth breakfast room, falling across the modest table where Eleanor sat with her mother and sister, the pale sunshine doing little to warm the chill she felt as she spread marmalade across toast she had no appetite to eat. Her mother, Mrs. Beatrice Ashworth, presided over the teapot with the careful attention she gave to all matters of household management, her face already showing the pinched expression that preceded one of her headaches, those convenient ailments that appeared whenever life failed to meet her exacting expectations. Margaret sat across from Eleanor, her younger sister's face still soft with the contentment of 2 years of happy marriage, her condition not yet showing, but revealed in the careful way she declined the kippers and chose only dry toast. And Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of love and envy that had become her constant companion since Margaret had wed. "I saw you speaking with the Duke of Pembroke last evening," Margaret said gently, her eyes warm with genuine interest rather than the calculation that would have marked their mother's inquiry. "He seemed quite engaged in your conversation before Lady Catherine interrupted." Mrs. Ashworth set down the teapot with more force than necessary, the china rattling against the saucer. "Do not fill your sister's head with fancies, Margaret," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of 11 seasons spent watching her eldest daughter fail to secure a match. His Grace was merely being polite, as any gentleman would be when trapped in a library with an unmarried lady. I am certain he thought nothing more of it. Eleanor felt the words land like stones in still water, the ripples of dismissal spreading through her chest, but she had learned long ago not to argue with her mother's assessments, had learned that defending herself only prolonged the discomfort and confirmed her mother's belief that Eleanor held foolish hopes beyond her station. "It was nothing, Mamma," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on her toast. "We spoke briefly of architecture, nothing of consequence." Margaret reached across the table to squeeze Eleanor's hand, a gesture of solidarity that made Eleanor's throat tighten with gratitude. But before either could speak further, the sound of the door knocker echoed through the small house with unusual force for such an early hour. They heard Perkins, their aging butler, shuffle to answer it, heard the murmur of voices, and then the old servant appeared in the doorway, holding a silver salver with a single envelope upon it, the thick cream paper and crimson wax seal unmistakably those of an aristocratic house. "For Mrs. Ashworth and family," Perkins announced, his usually steady voice betraying a hint of excitement, delivered by the Duke of Pembroke's footman. "Mrs. Gore's." Ashworth's hand flew to her throat as she took the letter, breaking the seal with fingers that trembled slightly, her eyes scanning the contents with increasing speed before she looked up at Eleanor with an expression that mingled shock, calculation, and something that might have been hope. "We have been invited to a garden party at Pembroke House," she said slowly, as though testing the reality of the words. 4 days hence. The invitation specifically names all 3 of us." Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat faster, felt the dangerous flutter of possibility rising in her chest, despite every lesson experience had taught her about the folly of hope. Margaret smiled broadly, but Mrs. Ashworth's gaze had already fixed on Eleanor with new intensity, her eyes cataloguing every deficit with the ruthless efficiency of a general assessing troops before battle. "We must see about your wardrobe," she said briskly, the headache apparently forgotten in the face of this unexpected development. "That green muslin might do if we add new trim, and your hair must be properly dressed, none of this simple style you prefer. If His Grace has taken some notice of you, we cannot squander the opportunity through carelessness." Eleanor said nothing, merely nodded, but inside she felt the precarious balance between hope and self-protection tip dangerously toward the former, and she wondered whether the Duke of Pembroke had any idea what tempest his simple invitation had unleashed in the quiet disappointment of her life. May 20th, 1817. The afternoon sun cast golden light across the gardens of Pembroke House, transforming the assembled guests into figures from a painting, their pastel gowns and dark coats arranged artfully against the backdrop of manicured lawns and flowering hedges that spoke of wealth so established it need not announce itself. Eleanor stood in the receiving line with her mother and Margaret, her hands clasped tightly before her to still their trembling, the green muslin gown with its new trim suddenly feeling like a costume meant for someone else, someone younger and more hopeful than the woman who wore it. The Duke of Pembroke greeted each guest with perfect courtesy, his manner formal and distant, and when Eleanor's turn came, his eyes passed over her with the same polite acknowledgement he had given the dozen guests before her, no flicker of recognition warming his expression, no reference to their library conversation.